On one cold night in January 1171, King Henry II of England could be found residing in Normandy at Argenton. The king would have had a lot on his mind. His relationship with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, had once again turned sour, after a period where it looked like things had been improving. Henry famously had been driven into a furious rage against the Archbishop, demanding loudly that he wished to be rid of this stubborn and headstrong priest. Four knights had overheard the king's outburst and took it literally. After feeble attempts to negotiate with Becket, the knights struck down the archbishop in cold blood on the night of the 29th of December 1170. After ransacking the cathedral, the four murderers fled. Their judgment would come in time. In the days that followed this horrific crime, Henry's rage would have cooled. After all, he still would have been ignorant of what had happened at Canterbury. Henry was a king who had a furious and at times a bizarre temper. On one occasion, he had become so enraged that he had thrown himself to the floor and started chewing hay. It's probable that he thought nobody would be stupid enough to put such value on his words, obviously spoken in anger and without any real meaning, that they would actually harm Thomas Becket. Whatever the king's mood was on that January night, it was about to take a serious turn for the worse. A group of men arrived at Argenton to speak with Henry. They came bearing the terrible news of Becket's demise. According to Ralph of Diceto, as soon as the messengers started talking, the king, almost as though he had been expecting such news, began to despair. The king cried out aloud to God that he had never wished for any such thing to happen, and he fell into a state of deep sorrow and misery. Undoubtedly, Henry certainly didn't want Becket dead. Thomas had at one time been Henry's good friend, but there was also probably a hint of self-pity in his wailings. Henry knew that this was a political disaster from which he may never recover. For him, it was now a matter of damage limitation. In a immediate show of remorse, Henry removed his royal robes, and in the manner of Becket, adopted a sackcloth shirt. He then sent envoys to the Pope, pleading his innocence. But predictably, the envoys did not receive a warm welcome in Rome. Pope Alexander III was understandably still furious at the murder of a man of God. The envoys tried to arrange a meeting with the Pope, but Alexander initially refused to have anything to do with them. The envoys tried again, and on this second occasion, some cardinals were sent to speak with them, but no action was taken. Eventually, after a period of confusion, two of the envoys, who seemed to have been more trusted than the rest of the diplomatic party, an abbot named Robert and an archdeacon also named Robert, were granted a hearing with Alexander. The first meeting bore little fruit, when, as soon as the envoys began to plead Henry's case, the cardinals began to jeer and heckle them. The two Roberts were forced to leave and return later that day to speak to Alexander in more subdued surroundings. Here it was made plain to the Pope that the fractious relationship between Henry and Becket was not only Henry's fault. Henry, after all, wanted to rid the English Church of corruption, which under Becket's watch was as bad as ever. This meeting turned hostile when the envoys were confronted by two of Becket's clerks from Canterbury. Matters between the King of England and the Pope were extremely tense, and the threat of excommunication hung over both Henry's and England's head. Whilst these awkward negotiations with the Pope were ongoing, Henry, still feeling the heat, decided to go on campaign in Ireland, where he landed in October 1171. Things went smoothly enough for the king in Ireland, but elsewhere more trouble was brewing. Henry II's son and heir, Henry the young king, was falling in with the wrong crowd, and these people were encouraging the young king to rebel against his father. The murder of Becket had begun a chain of events that would dominate the rest of Henry's reign. Whilst the young king's resentment against his father simmered. Henry, in 1172, began to finally make amends with the church. In late September of that year, at Avranches in Normandy, Henry swore, in front of the clergy and public, that he had never intended for Becket's death. He then made a series of vows. These vows included a promise to go on pilgrimage or crusade to Jerusalem. If he was unable to do so, then Henry would support the Christian cause in the Reconquista or reconquest of Spain. Unfortunately for Henry, matters closer to home would prevent him from doing so. Henry the young king, aided by his mother Eleanor, his brothers, and the King of France, began his revolt soon after his father had made these promises. At the very least, Henry was able to make generous donations to the Knights Templar, meaning he at least did give some support for the crusading cause. Before he obtained absolution for his greatest sin, Henry also had to forgive those who had aided Becket and who had joined him in exile in France. These men, both clergy and laymen alike, were allowed to return to England in peace. Henry also promised to restore any valuables that had been looted from Canterbury, of which there were a large amount, by the murderers of Becket. Henry was eventually absolved, but still the spectre of Becket lingered. In 1173, Becket was canonized by Pope Alexander, and with the revolt of his sons, it's likely that Henry still thought at this point he was still being punished by God. So in July 1174, he made another, very public act of penance. Riding to Canterbury, Henry, on approaching the city, leapt off his horse and walked to the cathedral barefoot. With tears falling, Henry made his way to Becket's tomb, where he fell to his knees. He remained there for a long time in silent prayer. When he rose to his feet, the king again protested his innocence. He then stripped away his garments and stood there bare-chested, ordering the monks to flog him. 3 to 5 blows were given from each monk, of which there was quite a crowd assembled. After receiving his punishment, Henry, dressing himself, allotted £40 of rent to be given to the cathedral annually, so candles could be lit around Becket's tomb. The king would spend the rest of the day praying, weeping, and enduring a restless night. Henry II's reign until 1170 had been a promising one. He was a remarkably energetic man who ruled his vast lands enthusiastically and highly capably. However, the souring of his relations with Becket had ultimately brought about his downfall. It can be argued that it wasn't really Henry's own fault. Since the days of King Stephen, the English Church had become rife with corruption, and Henry had been determined from the outset to put a stop to that. However, once Becket had become Archbishop of Canterbury, that task was made significantly more challenging, as Becket became obnoxious, stubborn, and inflexible. Henry's outburst in December 1170 had come after 8 years of arguments and frustrations with his archbishop. Although Henry could be a bad-tempered man at the best of times, I don't think he should be condemned too harshly for the murder of Thomas Becket. It was a combination of the king speaking carelessly, Becket's complete inflexibility, and the actions of 4 knights desperate to please the king, which had brought about one of history's most famous murders.